Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 82. And my guest in this episode is Louisa Barnum. And Louisa is a co-founder of an organization called Magenta FM. She founded it with her partner Jeff in 2014, and now they have Rachel Hazlett-Carr working with that team, and Jeff has stepped aside for his art career, and so Rachel and Louisa run Magenta FM as of the time of this recording. And I had this conversation with Louisa specifically, and we find out about what Magenta FM is, and it's actually a two-part conversation. And the first part is oriented towards the discovery of, again, what Magenta FM is and what it does, or what they do. And so the second conversation is Louisa and I just having a good dialogue and talking about a lot of different things, mostly revolving around philosophy. So I will be publishing that second conversation a little bit later on, perhaps in a week. I'll give you time to watch this one. So thank you so much for watching this, and enjoy. And I'd like to welcome Louisa Barnum to the IdeaCast interview series. And for the next hour or so, I'm looking forward to a very fruitful and insightful conversation. I really want to pick Louisa's brain about the project that she's created. There's a history to the project that's a little more complex than I could do justice for in the introduction, so I will, in a moment, allow her to do more justice to that. But I will start by saying that she and her collaborative partner, Rachel, and Hazlett-Carr, I wrote that down so I wouldn't get any mistakes on people's names, because I don't like to do that. Not for my ego, it's just I want to respect their name. So, Louisa, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Yes, and as I mentioned a second ago, I want to talk about Magenta FM, your co-creating partner, Rachel, and yourself. And it was actually started with you and your husband years ago, but again, we'll unpack all of that in good time. To the audience, first of all, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to have you all here. I want to perhaps put out a disclaimer here that Louisa and Rachel have a service. They have a website that offers master classes and things like that. And I just want to say to the audience that if I didn't believe in something, or if I did my research and I thought something was hokey, or I didn't have a good vibe to it, I wouldn't have them here as a guest. And so I say that because I think for the first part of this conversation, we are going to talk about what Rachel and Louisa are doing. And I just want you to know that this is born of sincerity on my end, that I wouldn't have anybody here if I didn't like the work, I didn't believe in the work, it didn't map onto what I do or what I've covered in the past. So I just wanted to put that out there as an offering to the audience. I think this, if you're here in the audience and you're doing transformative work, and you're doing work on helping yourself, pulling yourself out of whatever the existential crisis might be, whether it's something in the past, something going on in the present, I think Louisa and Rachel are going to have some good space for you to enter into and do some work. So that was a long-winded introduction there. But I do want to hand it over to you now, Louisa, because I think a good sort of classical background discovery and introduction would be in order, and we'll build up from that and find out about what you guys are doing with Magenta FM. So welcome again, and I'll hand it over to you, and you can get us up to speed on what's going on.
All right. Well, so I appreciate your caveat, because we have a similar need for a caveat too, because what we're doing is, we're not trained therapists, we're not psychologists. We really are interested in the art of something, the art of mental health, the art of relationships, the art of social fields building. And part of the art of that is healing. And so we are very much focused on healing. And it has Magenta has a bit of a convoluted past. My husband and I co-founded it in, 2013, I think. I was already a pretty experienced coach at that point. And my husband left his consultancy that he had co-founded, and that now has offices all over the world. And they focused very much on social change, large-scale, methodologies around solving complex and tough social problems. And I often worked with the consultants who were doing that work, and the consultants are facilitators and they're process designers. So, and then after 2013, I myself began to work on these projects. But it's a tough kind of a profession. And what I think essentially we became really disillusioned, because what we saw was needed was being ignored. And a lot of what was happening was focused on fixing the systems out there without acknowledging the full human being, the problem owners and their inner realm, their inner world. There's a lot of trauma going on in these really difficult situations, but very little understanding or knowledge about trauma. So, and me, in my coaching world, I was working with people who had very difficult personal experiences that they were working through. And many of them had been in therapy for many years, but they hadn't really made the progress that they really wanted to make. And I come from this completely different background, like no therapy, no psychology training, but a very deeply steeped background in music. So I understood what it takes to build capacity. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I have been meditating since I was in my early 20s. And I come from I suppose you could say, a school of thought, or a kind of a spiritual background that is not very well known, because it is steeped in Western esoteric streams of wisdom. And they were very much suppressed throughout the last 2,000 years. Whereas, as you probably know, a lot of the more Eastern style threads of spiritual development were never really suppressed in the same way. They're very well known and very accessible. So I had these two things and my own healing journey. And so I really was bringing this to bear in my coaching, and discovering that I had a lot of tools and concepts that I could bring that were very practical. And also that I'd learned that were coming out of, some of the tools and stuff that I learned from participating in social labs and projects like that, where I had to build and you could say design capacity building for the teams that were holding these really difficult spaces. So that was sort of some of the things that I did. But again, we were really disillusioned by this whole space. And so I think in 2020, by then we were really getting into online courses and online course building. So we'd done some of that for clients, and then we, started creating more public based courses. And that was cool. That was fun. But a lot of really, really hard work. And at that time, my husband, he's always been a painter, so 30 years of art making. And it's always what he's really wanted to do. He never meant to become a consultant. It sort of was an accident, a happy accident. It was a very, fruitful experience. But his art career took off, basically. And I was like, honey, go do that. You can go do that. So he did. And then I was sort of left wondering what to do with what we had done. This huge body of work that we had built and developed over the years. And then I really needed a partner. How do I develop this? What do I do with this? It needs a new form. It needs new ways of being in service. And so I invited my friend and a previous client, actually. She was CEO of a company before Magenta, and she hired us to help her with some capacity building in our company. And then she left that and became a mother and needed something to do. And I'm like, why don't you come work with me? And she did. And I'm very lucky to have her. So the two of us, we really have brought a new sort of breathe new life into what we're doing, and really, really just focusing on the personal development side of things and the healing side of things. But more than that, also the how we connect to and develop and bring to bear our mission, our life's purpose. Why are we here? And so much of healing is about overcoming all that holds us back. And we empty out over time of all that is dark and sticky and of the nature of the shadow. And then we're empty. And then we're finally able to receive. And we receive pictures and intimations and intuitions of a path of service and life purpose that wasn't possible before the healing. But after, as we're on our journey, become more and more, like, especially as you get older, it's like, I don't have time to waste anymore. What am I here to do? What am I here to accomplish? That's what we're really interested to help people with. Yeah, so how's that landing with you? What's coming up?
I'll preface what I'm going to say by saying that I listened to a couple of your podcasts on YouTube, and I found that the way in which you communicate, and you mentioned the shadow a moment ago, that you do use some Jungian language, and I think that opening up, becoming more of an integrated approach to the process of healing or transformation or retrieval from some whatever existential crisis might be going on, that you guys, by using the language of art, the language of broader communication, I think is at the very least very complementary to what might be more orthodox, psychology or whatever therapy that you might engage with. So that lands well with me, that you guys are you and Rachel are comprehensive in that regard, that you are another aspect, another facet on the diamond of doing that work to prism the work and using the metaphor of clarity, that you can help people in that regard. And that's, again, what I find very attractive. And so in listening to a couple hours of your communication with Rachel, that stands out to me, that this is yet another means that you all have developed to help people, to steward them and to guide them through. And I think healing is a journey process. It's nonlinear. It is, it's multi-directional, depending on where you have to go. Sometimes you have to go in the past. Sometimes you have to deal with now. Sometimes you have to stop, fussing over the future. So that's what's landing with me, is that you guys are really opening up something creative. And again, using your experience with the arts, with music, to me, I'll abstract backwards and say, or unabstract to aesthetics and visual cues for humanity. So to almost reduce it down to something that we are creatures of symbolism. We are creatures of semiotics, like symbols and signifiers and things like that. So that, I think, is crucial in our journey, as well as other modalities and therapies. But what you guys are tapping into, I think, is essential. So maybe in my response, you can give us, myself and the audience, a picture of where you are now, what you guys are doing, and drill down a little bit more into how you approach this kind of work. So we're talking about not being the conventional. You said you have your caveats that you're not psychology and this isn't therapy or anything like that. And I think that's important too. I'll just be redundant for a moment. I just really think it's essential. So if you want to open that up some more for us, I think that would be cool.
Yeah. Okay. So I think what informs, so much of our work is kind of like this two-step process in personal transformation. The first one is healing the shadow, to use the Jungian term. It's very useful because it's kind of pictorial, right? So if you use more of the languaging of someone else, one of my teachers, Georg Kuhlewint, who was a Polish physicist and writer and meditant, he taught me to meditate, and he called the shadow realm the subconscious. And probably Jung did too, but he categorized it in that way. So all of that in us, which is untransformed, chaotic, and so for instance, wounds and weakness and immaturities and trauma and stories that we tell ourselves, all that we're not really conscious of and aware of. So that whole process of becoming structured there. So that's one step. And then the second step is what we categorize as strengthening the light. In order to be able to see into the subconscious, you have to be conscious, right? You can't see into what you're not able to see. You have to grow a light so that you can peer into the darkness. You've got to be able to illuminate what's in there. And this, I think, is a big problem in a lot of what goes on in counseling and therapy and so forth, especially when it comes to trauma or adverse childhood experiences and PTSD, any kind of situation where you have a lot of internal dysregulation. If you try and, like, for instance, go back into the past and understand what happened, you can re-traumatize, you can entrench the internal dysregulation if you don't have a corresponding practice of strengthening, like soul training, like strength training for the soul. Like, you wouldn't run a marathon if you hadn't extensively trained your physical muscles. And, you know, it's an apt analog, because I think it's also appropriate for when we're doing personal development. So we really are focused on both of these things, and they happen, you could say, simultaneously. I mean, of course, the work of the working on the shadow is strengthening, for sure. But if you're only doing that, then there can be a problem. So this strengthening of the light means that you become more, you develop more agency in what you're thinking. So you become more awake and aware of the thoughts in your head, and also the mental picture forming. So that's a whole thing we can talk about at some point. But also more agency in your feeling life. You know, what are you feeling? And we can differentiate quite a bit in the feeling life, and we can actually characterize or categorize certain types of feelings, those that are, you could say, unhelpful, and others that are actually regenerative. And we have to learn how to work with both of these feelings, because we don't want any suppression. So there's all these tools and techniques for that. So there's quite a lot of this kind of, you know, one step, two step kind of broad general term. There's a lot to that, but let's just sort of say that. And then what we're doing now is really focused on trying to bring all of this knowledge and all of this understanding and all of this information that we have, just bring it, like, through the podcast, through our email newsletter, through all our socials, all the channels that we have on our YouTube channel, all of it. Like, we're not holding anything back, and we're not hiding it behind a paywall. It's just, we're trying to work through and make this information available to everyone for free. We're not, you know, this is not a situation in which we want to make it into IP. Like, oh, here's our secret source, and you have to. So what we do inside Magenta, so we do that. We have a sort of a whole rhythm around that. But then the other part of what we do is we have a course and a membership program. So we have a course that's all about helping you get started with meditation. It's like a 21-day process for getting you into the specific kind of meditation that we teach that supports the healing work. And not every meditation is appropriate, in my view, for that healing work, but ours is. But also we have this membership program that we're starting in June, and it is all about helping with the practice part of it. Because all the information in the world isn't going to help you if you're not exercising, right? If you're not training those soul muscles. And that's a very big part of the process of transformation. And of course, I know this really well, because when you learn to play an instrument, so my instrument was the violin, it's a huge amount of practice every day that you have to do if you want to get any good. And it's not like you have to be practicing hours and hours a day of personal development, but you've got to be doing something every day. And, you could call it like basic soul hygiene. Like, would you ever miss brushing your teeth? No, you wouldn't. And it's the same with something like, soul hygiene. Like meditation is a fantastic way of making small but significant progress over and strengthening your soul for the work over long periods of time. So let me just pause there and see how that's landing.
A lot of landing there for me, so I'll try not to get too...
Okay, good. Tell me more.
Yeah, I'm going to try to rein in my ADD brain. So let me go back a little bit and to bring Young back in for a moment. I know he dabbled and he liked to play around with the ideas of hermeticism and alchemy and things like that. And you had a line in one of your podcasts, you were talking about cooking and eating your shadow. And I like that in a sense. Yeah, I like that because it is a transmutation. It's an alchemical process where you're transforming shadowiness, which, let me present this to you and we can go back and forth a little bit. Like, for me, the shadow is like the Tao. It's the yin and the yang. I mean, it's part of who we are. It's part of what we are. And so I would say almost like ego, because we talk about ego a lot too. And we don't want to eliminate the ego. We don't want to, get rid of it, destroy it. But how does this work for you if I say we don't want to destroy the shadow, but we want to understand its presence in our lives and how it shows up for us. And if, like you said, we illuminate, that there's a salience mapping of the shadow, and that like any injury, any wound, especially mental wounds and things like that, that they're always going to be there, but you've managed them. And so let me put that back to you, and then I'll hit a couple other things that landed for me. But let's talk about the shadow for a moment, open that up, and then talk to me about the relationship between shadow and light, and where you think the positive valence is there for a person you're working with in terms of shadow integration, shadow management, or however you want to phrase that.
Yeah. Well, I think, where do I start? So I think the main thing here is the transformation of the shadow is not about, it's not about winning a battle. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not about either or. It's about redemption. And redemption is my sort of closest word that I've been able to find for this process, because I think that when you talk about the shadow, you're talking about basically a spiritual aspect of a holistic experience of being human, that we harbor in our psyches, or our holisticness, however you want to call it, whatever your language might be. We harbor these potentials and these wounds and these weaknesses that are invitations toward something. So for instance, sometimes what people can find when they begin to meditate, or they begin to look at something in themselves, that things will, like when you sit down to meditate, what you meet there is not peace, but it's agitation, because the shadow is looking for healing, or the wound is looking for redemption, you could say. And to my mind, redemption is a picture of how. So when you're looking at something that's where you're holding pain, or where you're suffering, and you are sitting, say you sit down to meditate, and you feel all this agitation, and the resentment and the grief and the despair is there, and you're like, there is no way I can possibly meditate when all of this is going on, so just to give you a picture of how things can show up in our sort of daily experience. What's needed is not that you suppress, not that you deny, but obviously there's this loving, compassionate acknowledgement of what lives in you. Mm-hmm. And I think in there is the secret to what constitutes true healing. I don't think that we have to live with the fact of the shadow and manage it. I think we can get to that point, but we can and should move beyond that toward healing. But of course, the shadow shows up at different octaves, right? So we address an issue, we move through it. It isn't a part of things, but then some years later or whatever, next month, we meet it again, but it's in a different permutation. It's like at a higher octave, at a more sophisticated level. And then we address it again. So there's a lot of wounds that are like that, but there's this continual evolving. And I think the only real true way that we can heal the shadow is through this process of redemption, which the reason why I like the word so much is because what is in there implicit is love, and love being the supreme healing force of the universe. Because there is an intelligence in there. Anyway, there's a lot to say. I'm not sure if this is quite answering your question, but let me just pause and see what's coming up.
No, I think that was a great explanation, and it clarified for me your interpretation of what the project is about, or what the goals that are being set are. The space that you're creating in those in that goal setting. And again, I don't say goal in a linear hierarchical fashion. It's more that you, like you said, you're going up, you're upscaling to different octaves. And so that if the shadow follows you up, that you may be more aware of it, that you may recognize things more, that you can let go more efficiently then, and dance with that work a little better, if I'm interpreting what you said correctly. And so the other thing that I was going to ask you from what you were saying before was the meditative practice itself. And can you open up a little bit and talk about what's unique about what you engage with in a mindfulness practice, and maybe not necessarily in the nitty gritty of the details. Folks can find that out about what you do when they engage with you, but just maybe some ideas of how this relationship works, doing shadow work, I guess, in mindfulness. Maybe we could frame it that way.
Yeah. So meditation comes from an esoteric background. It was designed to be a part of the toolkit or the accompaniment of a person who is, in those mystery schools around the world, and is a part of their process of development. So any mystery school, any path of esoteric development around the world has the same words inscribed on the entrance, which is know yourself. And meditation has to be a part of that. But not only that, I think, in my world, meditation has to also include an understanding of the anatomy of the human being, and specifically an anatomy of the soul. And what I mean by soul is where the contents of our shadow reside, but also it's also where we interface with what I'm going to call, for lack of a better word, if anybody has a better word for this, please tell me, but also where we interface with our higher self. And this is what I mean by anatomy. And there's a lot to say about anatomy, because the human being is immensely complicated. This is a part of the knowledge that has been lost to us throughout the thousands of years, especially in the Western esoteric streams. There's so much persecution that went on. Like the alchemists hid their esoteric knowledge in their writings and their drawings. They're very mysterious and they're full of errors, but they were very deliberate errors, because they're meant to lead people astray. And so a lot of people, it's not necessarily not true. A lot of people think that alchemy was the precursor to chemistry, for instance. But that's a very I understand, and it might be true, but really alchemy was about exploring the precise analogs that you can find in nature and substance as analog for the transformation and healing of the soul. That's what it was about. And that's why cooking, eating the shadow comes out of alchemy, because it's really truly what you do. You have to face your stuff, and you have to cook it, and then you have to eat it, as in you have to own it. You can't blame anybody else for your situation. You have to learn how to take 100% responsibility. It doesn't mean that you're to blame for anything, but it does mean, right, taking it on.
Yeah, yeah. And that's something that in one of the podcasts I watched that you and Rachel handled really well, in my opinion, because I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because you talk,
that.
well, you talk about this and you're like, okay, you show up, somebody triggers you, and then you have to understand and catch the projection that's coming out because you're wounded. And there's, and so I'll get on a soapbox for a minute. I think when we come up as human beings from infancy to pubescence to adulthood, we're onboarding so much information, whether it's language, whether it's what we're learning in school, whether it's learning to be part of the community, the family and the extended family and the tribe, et cetera. There's so much to take in, but there's a cost benefit to that. You're kind of making the Moloch steel where there's a price to pay for onboarding all of that. And a lot of that's trauma. You're unfiltered when you're a child, and children don't know new. So there's my soapbox. And it's like, no wonder we're train wrecks by the time we're, in our 30s, right?
Yeah.
So I'll just use that as a means of accentuating what you've said and what the task that has been laid out in front of us in this process, and the beauty of alchemy in the transformative process, and using symbolism and metaphor of earth elements and other things to demonstrate to us the path through our psyche. So for me, psyche and soul are synonymous, mind and soul.
They probably are. Yes.
For me, this is just me. So I'm not, it's not prescriptive.
I don't see why not. Yeah.
But it's an easy way to connect with ensoulment very quickly. So we could think of the abstract soul, like, well, do I go on beyond me and when I die? This is where we are in real time. And so for me, it's an easy, just a thing to pin. So anyway, but yes.
I didn't quite finish let me just finish talking a little bit about meditation, because
yes, please.
We don't really focus on there are Eastern methods of meditation, and I'm not very familiar with them. Rachel is much more so, because she spent many years doing Zen meditations. And one characteristic that's different is that we don't use breathing. We don't use any physical breathing. We are very much focused on a specific kind of training in the thinking life. Not because we're overly intellectualizing things. This is an easy misunderstanding that people have, but because because so much of what happens in things like anxiety is that we have to get to know the mental picture forming process. So mental pictures as in what we believe, what we assume, the conclusions we jump to, how we think things through, or the way I'd like to call it is our thoughting. So what we do is we often repeat thoughts that we've already had, and they go on repeat, and we don't even realize that they're running. Like, we're all familiar with the stream of consciousness that is constantly affecting our mood. And because so often what's going on in there is really negative and self-derogatory. And so that needs to become much more illuminated with our consciousness. And that's just baseline, right? And from there, so meditation has to work there. And then there's the whole feeling life. Let me just take a moment to say why. We all know it's important, but it's so ubiquitous that we don't realize how unconscious we are there too. And feeling life is a lot harder to intervene in. Like, if you are completely overtaken by rage, it's not like you have a choice to not be enraged or not. Or if you are really feeling a lot of self-pity, to choose not to feel it, you've got two choices: to continue to feel it or to suppress it, neither of which is really helpful or good. So how do we take a hold of our feeling life, and in very healthy and regenerative healing ways, find agency again? So this is we're very focused on that as another baseline area. So meditation has to be able to touch in on this mental picture forming process, and in finding ways to intervene in the feeling life and build capacity there, so that we have more choice about whether we go to rage or whether we go to self-pity or despair or hopelessness or apathy. We've got to be able to intervene in particular kinds of feelings. But that, you know, that takes exercise and it takes training. So that's very much a part of the meditation. And the third part of the anatomy of the soul is we have to include the will. So the place where the impulse to do something, behaviors, come from, and so much of our behaviors are actually quite compulsive. We become addicted to certain thoughts about ourselves or about the world. We become addicted to certain feelings like despair, because at least we know who we are when we're in that place of, you know, wallowing in self-pity or whatever it is. I spend a lot of time in wallowing in self-pity, so I speak from
been there
experience.
before. Yeah,
Exactly. So the will, being able to have a crowbar that you can stick in there and have a choice about whether you're going to go down that road or not. So those are the three main areas that meditation has to be able to intervene in if it's really going to be effective and assist you on this path of healing. So how does that land?
That's powerful, because typically if our audience, if you hadn't said what you said, our audience would think, or I'll stand in a proxy, is that it's mindfulness is a clearing process. It's an emptying of the space that you're shutting down the monkey mind. But I think what you're doing is more relationality. It's reciprocal. It is this building rather than deconstruction. If I'm reading you right, and please correct me, that you all are actively engaging someone while they're in mindfulness to do this kind of work of the three facets that you mentioned. And I like that, because and that can pair or map on nicely with the emptying process too. That could be another meditation that you can do later, because that might be a good complementarity there. So yeah, I love that. I think that's really important. And so that I could then segue to the third thing from our first How Did It Land with you was discipline. You've touched on it lightly a couple of times. Oh, and I want to touch on the will, but let's talk about discipline first.
Sure.
And they may be connected, but you have a background in music and violin and singing, and so to show up as someone who's cultivated their talents, they had to spend time, as you suggested, working on themselves, working on the instrument. And so you don't hear that a lot in transformation work or self-help work, is the discipline that's required. It's all been very much for the and I'm not saying this in judgment, but it's less delayed gratification and more of that you can do it, just activate your 13-strand crystalline DNA by like you said, by breathing or barking or chanting or whatever. And it's like, wait a minute, guys, we're still fleshy little creatures. And so I really, really appreciate that, because discipline, I think, is something that needs to be onboarded and carried through in that process. So please speak to discipline before I keep rambling too much.
So don't be put off by the word discipline. Like you then have to sit and meditate for many hours a day. That's not what's needed. But it's interesting. So one of the strange things about practice is, let's say you practice your violin for 10 minutes a day. So that would be 17 minutes a week over 7 days. But then let's say you forgot to do your practice, and so you practice for 3 hours on one day. That's way more than 70 minutes. Which one is going to get you further? I'm asking you that question. See what comes up for you. Beyond that being a rhetorical question, I would say that the muscle memory and the building, the firing wiring process, whatever you want to call it, is more gently uploaded or onboarded through that more normal routine, the predictable routine, rather than trying to cram everything into 3 hours where your brain's gonna be like, after 20 minutes it's going to give up, because you're I think you're asking too much. And I don't know neuroscience, but I just think that you would be asking too much. Rather, the bite-sized pieces that you can do every day, and it's routine, it's habitualized. So I would intuit that this 10 minutes equals 70 minutes is better than the 180 minutes or whatever when you're cramming. So well, you're right. That's exactly right.
Okay. So, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so this is a really important secret. And the reason why is something called rhythm. So rhythm is something that you see everywhere. I mean, in terms of analogs in nature, is absolutely everywhere. The rhythm of the pulsing of the vortexial nature of water flowing, the rhythm of the seasons, day and night, our heartbeat. It's absolutely everywhere. And wherever there's thriving life, there's going to be rhythm. And we can use that. And to speak to your coming question about the will, this is a secret to not having to use willpower to like muscle through, is you use rhythm, which means you build it into your life, let's say at the same time every day. I always do my meditation first thing in the morning before too much has, passed through my mind.
Okay.
So that I have the right setup for the rest of the day. And I get up at the same time every day, and go to bed at the same time every day, so that my well-being is strengthened by using using rhythm. And there's a quote from Rudolf Steiner, who's a big influence in what we do in Magenta. Rhythm replaces strength. So when you build the rhythm into your life, whatever the practice is, maybe it's journaling because you can't quite, you're not ready to meditate, so journaling. But if you do it at the same time every day, it gets built into your life and it becomes a part of your life. And again, it's like soul hygiene. You don't want to do without it, Yeah.
No, Steiner's a great example, because I first and second grade in my elementary education, I went to a Waldorf school, which was his creation.
Cool.
Yeah, and their system was interesting. And unfortunately for me, I got taken out of the Waldorf system and put into a Catholic school. So like,
wow.
I didn't know, I couldn't spell my name in the second grade, and the Catholic kids,
dear.
they were really well along in their reading and writing in the third grade. So it didn't work for me. But the genius of how they would bring kids into things rhythmically. So we learned a lot of arts, we learned dance, we learned painting and the recorder.
Knitting.
So just these very nice rhythmic teaching systems. And then they would bring the harder things on science and literature and things like that later. But so I'm sorry. Steiner's a great example of that. That just makes so much sense, to go with what's natural and go with what we're consciously or unconsciously aware of. Like you said, you go to bed at a certain time. Nobody ever complains about eating 3 meals a day. They just, I'm looking forward to lunch or breakfast, or having a nice dinner with my family. And that's a very natural thing that we don't really question. We don't call, sometimes people reference brushing your teeth, but I think eating is something more pleasurable than brushing your teeth. But it's all habituation. So I totally get that. So in one of your dialogues with Rachel, you had talked about, I'll segue to the will with this. And I love the way you did this. You'd say, rather than hard masculine, hard feminine, and, all the ambiguities that can come up from that you talk about a soft will and a hard will. And it may not, so will can have a couple different meanings here as we're about to go into it. And I want you to be in charge of that you direct how we're talking about will. But I wanted to throw that out just as an example of what I thought was really clever, that we have this way of talking about will or wills. So I'll hand that off to you and unpack will for us. Or wills.
Well, so we could talk about the will in the what would be helpful in terms of a context, because it's a big topic. Maybe in the context of healing and personal work. I mean, maybe in the context of like bringing personal practices in a more rhythmical way, because of course one of the big issues that people have with, like, let's say bringing a meditation practice to life, they like, I know I need this, but I just can't sustain it, because they just can't find the willpower to do it, right? So what drives the willpower, that's very important to the nature of the will, is enthusiasm, is warmth. So this is partly why learning how to cultivate what I call cognitive style feelings in meditation is so important, because those feelings, the nature of those particular kinds of feelings, and I'm going to give you some examples in a minute, warm the will, and they fill the will with a kind of quality of enthusiasm that can help you overcome many obstacles. And one of those is the difficulties of facing ourselves, you could say. And there's two kinds of, let me just sort of shelve that for a minute. There's lots of kinds of wills, but let's just talk about two, the ones that you mentioned, soft and hard. So soft will is more like a receptive will. It's like a creative will. It's like on the periphery. And I mean, it's really hard to separate out will from thinking, and will from feeling, and thinking from feeling, and all of these things. But one thing I learned from playing the violin is that when you separate out all the elements that make up playing a really difficult passage, the left hand technique from the right hand technique, you just pull apart every single piece of an aspect of the technical difficulty to its most singular elements, and then practice each one separately. And then you can add two together and practice those together. And then you can add, and then you gradually build it up. It's really difficult to do because it takes a lot of discipline, and but it's the most efficient way, because at the end of it, what you will find is you can now play the piece.
Yeah.
But it's the same with inner work. We have to separate out these elements and study them and understand them, understand their anatomy, understand their phenomena. So that we can have them separate, and then we can put them back together again with far, far greater understanding. So this is also a big part of what we do, is really working on the anatomy of all of these things, the phenomena. What can we observe? Because this is a first-person science. You are the subject and you're the object. This is not very easy. So we have to build the tools and the organs of perception so that we can actually be the subject and the object. And the way we can do that is using a phenomenological approach, but also having some handrails. That's what anatomy is like some kind of navigational tool. Yeah. So soft will is you could characterize it as like a creative, receptive will, where you do nothing. you listen, and you are receptive, and it's kind of a state of being open to inspiration, and it's everything gets done by doing nothing kind of state of being. But then you have the hard will, which is pretty much maybe as it sounds. It's where you are very active. You are doing it. It is being done, and you are pushing. It's a hard push. So people do characterize the hard will as more of that masculine direction, and the soft will as a feminine receptivity. But we need both. We need both.
And that sounds very Tao too, where the soft will is very Wu Wei, and then there's more of an active Qi kind of will in the hard will. And I want to gather my thoughts for a second on that. I'll intuit, and you come back to me with this, that the will in the soft will sense is receptivity, but it also is maybe being silent and finding the innateness of will within you. Like there is this inherent will that can be maybe discovered. Is that a separate will, or do you think that may be part of the composite of the soft will, that you feel this emergent quality of a will coming out of it that you may not have recognized, and you gave that space for it to be there? Or would it be more about just the external phenomenological world revealing to you things that your soft will can again onboard or process or discover? So let me throw that to you and see if any of that.
Well, I mean, they sound kind of like the same thing to me.
Okay.
I think if you like, I realized that I have this background in music, so I have a background in art. But here's the thing, like I said earlier, the healing and transformation, it's an art form too. And in any sort of art form, we need to be able to be receptive to inspiration, to ideas that we've not thought of.
Okay.
A really interesting state in the soul that shuts down the software, and that beautiful, receptive, creative mode is fear. Like, fear is a creativity killer. So if we dwell chronically in a state of fear, which is what anxiety is, for instance, it's really hard to get to know and to know what it feels like, if you've ever felt it, to be in a state of soft will, to have that beautiful creative, and you are silent, because you have to be empty in order to receive. Because if you're like a full cup, you're just full of thoughts and opinions and ideas and monkey mind, then you're not empty and receptive. So this is another place where meditation is really help, like mindfulness practices of emptying out. I mean, I prefer to work on the emptying out piece in the realm of emptying out of shadow. And the emptying out happens in the healing process. And Steiner calls that the transformation of the astral body, by the way. We don't really talk, I'm only saying that to you, we don't really talk about it in that language, because it's like, what's the astral body? But that's kind of a technical term for the soul, you could say.
Sure.
And this is the path of esoteric development, is the transformation of the soul. And alchemy is full of images of that. And also Hermeticism and these other more Western esoteric streams, and like Rosicrucianism and so forth. So so there's this well, how's that all landing with you?
Good. And so, to build on that just a little bit more, I would say you had touched on, we were talking about Jung earlier, and so I'll bring in the collective unconscious, and there's other ways of describing that. It could be a singularity of a scale invariant intelligence, whatever you want to call it, but that, the soft will, the receptivity, maybe you are expanding your cognitive, I just interviewed a biologist, he had a great word, it's called a cognitive light cone. It is your capacity to introspect, and it's your capacity to plan and predict, and it becomes this cone, and there's the singularity of the present, and there's the past and the future, and so a flea or a tick or some little creature doesn't have a very large cognitive light cone. It's living very now, very present, because that's all it needs to do by way of adaptation. But folks like us, we can have oscillating light cones, I think, in this regard, in the soft will, in the receptivity, in the ability to, metacognize in the downward direction or past, and maybe in the upward direction in the future. So that's, again, where I would invoke some idea of the collective unconscious, that in the soft will mode, that you are accessing greater potential. And we could call that the intuition, or the creative mind, the mind of the artist, the mind that can take out of, like your husband, out of pure nothingness, put something on canvas or whatever medium, and there all of a sudden is creation. So I'll hand that back over to you. But I think we could go on a lot about the soft will, but that takes the hard will too to activate. So if an artist has an idea, a musical piece or any other medium, that then they have to act on it. They then have to maybe perhaps generate that harder will to actualize it or bring it into existence. So I'll stop there and see what you think about that, if that makes sense, or if it's landing right, by way of what you do.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to hold on to a lot of,
I know I threw a lot out. I'm sorry.
A lot of directions that we could go. So in terms of this cone, I think we have to get more precise about what exactly we're connecting to. And in our languaging, what we need to do is connect to our higher self. And the reason why is because the higher self, which is our purely spiritual nature, maybe it's one way we could describe it, there is a part of us that is not wounded and not broken and not enslaved to the compulsive nature of the shadow. And that's our higher self. And that part of us is what we need to learn how to tap into, because it's not been given to us. We've been given this physical body. We've been given this soul, the thinking and the feeling and the willing, all these capacities. We've been given these organs of perception. But there's a lot of things that the gods have stepped back and said, all right, it's up to you now, what you're going to do with this. This is the nature of your exploration of freedom. What are you going to do with what you've been given? And I think a part of that kind of setup, right, is that we aren't, it's like we have a choice if we're going to tap into our higher nature, if we're going to take a higher road, if we're going to learn how to tap into that source of inspiration. Which God are you going to follow? And not to say that our higher self is a God, but like I was having this conversation with my husband recently, we were realizing that we were getting really bent around this question of money. And looking back on so much of our married life where we were bent around the problem or the challenge of making money. And we look back and oh, sorry, that's my dog making noise.
Okay. Dogs are welcome. I got a cat in my lap right now. She's sitting down on my lap.
Oh, that's so sweet.
It's bloody hot in this room, but that must be love, because she's not here for the warmth. It's like 80 degrees in the room. So anyway, wow. Dogs are welcome on the podcast.
He's my daughter's taking care of him.
Oh, okay. All right.
Shoot, what was I saying? I
forgot. We both got derailed, but you were talking about
the higher self, and
yes, the higher self.
Oh yeah, so God
money
do you follow?
God.
Yeah. So we look back and we're like, we were following the wrong God for a long time, where we were so worried and focused on money. And we weren't enough attending to what really mattered to us, what we really cared about. Instead, we were, concerned and afraid, really, and bent around the pole of money. So, that's what I mean by like, don't follow the wrong God. So, really connecting to our higher self and our higher nature. What does that mean? Well, it's so in the maybe we'll tie it back to the meditative practice. What that means is we're really after the truth, and not the truth that we would prefer, not the truth as we decide, but the truth that wishes to reveal itself to us in its complexity. And Steiner has another thing, another quote: truth lies in paradox. And so when we connect to our higher self, what we're trying to do is start to have a feel for the complex nature of truth, whether we like it or not. So that's one aspect, is truth. And there's a kind of integrity, a moral integrity in the truth. And then another aspect of it is love, because when you are the work of connecting to your higher self is a work of redemption. Like you've got to heal of your stuff, you empty out of it, and then you're this receptive cup into which you can receive inspiration. Well, where does that inspiration come from? It comes from truth and love, because if it's not those things, then what is it? Which God are you following, right? So I think that there's a lot to say about the higher self, and we do our very best to come at it, like we're constantly coming at it from all these different angles, because it's not something that we talk about very much in general vernacular. But in my world, it's a very essential part of so learning how to engage the higher self in your healing process. Because what is it that actually heals you? What is it that heals you? I think I'm proposing that it's cognition.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Bible, there's stories of the Christ who was wandering around and healing people. Well, he didn't heal them with herbs and acupuncture and pharmaceuticals and complicated things. He just healed them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what the stories are trying to convey or show is that what he was doing was he was seeing into their shadow. So he was seeing into their wound, their, or in the Bible language, their sins.
Mm-hmm.
And he was seeing into their higher self and their potential. And he was also cognizing that they were willing to give up their sins. They were willing to acknowledge. They were open to redemption. And so it was this power of the cognition, which is in Greek called, or the word, logos.
Yep.
And the power of the word, just for the past 15 years of doing coaching, what unlocked people was that they were finally able to articulate what the true name of their wound. Mm-hmm. They found the words. They could tell the story. They could, the true name, that's a kind of a mythological way of saying they really understand the wound in its entirety. And they could cognize it. And this is the illumination mm-hmm. that the higher self brings. Mm-hmm. And so that's why for me that, connecting to this is what strength training of the soul actually is. Mm-hmm. It's connecting to this illuminating ability of the higher self to be completely objective about what's happening. So another Jungian term is the witness. Mm-hmm. And you could say that the witness is the muscle of the eye or the higher self. It's how we get really strong in being able to very objectively and with no judgment and no assessment, observe with finer and finer, more subtle abilities, what's actually going on in us. So how does all that